Hello and welcome. I'm Jack Fink. You're watching Eye on Politics on CBS News Dallas-Fort Worth. We teamed up with CBS News and YouGov for a new Texas poll. There are so many issues you are facing these days, from the high gas prices, inflation, the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, and gun laws and school safety in the aftermath of the deadly mass shooting in Uvalde. Before we hear where you and many other Texans are on these issues, we want to begin with the Texas governor's race between two-term incumbent Republican Greg Abbott and Democratic challenger Beto O'Rourke. Abbott leads O'Rourke by 8 percentage points, 49% to 41%. When it comes to his job performance, more people disapprove of the job the governor is doing than approve, 54 to 46%. Compare that to President Joe Biden. His approval rating here in Texas is 41%, 59% disapprove. We asked the director of election surveys for CBS News, Anthony Salvanto, about the race.
The contest at this point stands in Abbott's favor at 49-41, and there's really a couple of perhaps very simple explanations for that. One is that Abbott has the support of Republicans, and there just are more Republicans saying they're planning to vote in this contest, as is typically the case in Texas. The other part of this is the extent to which this race perhaps might become nationalized. And even though the governor's overall job approval rating is net negative, people would still vote for him over O'Rourke, and part of that is that they believe, Texans believe, that the state of Texas is doing better than the nation overall, that the Texas economy is doing better than the nation's overall. Another aspect of this, Jack, is that the governor gets relatively higher approval ratings in the state than President Joe Biden does. So to the extent that this race is nationalized, and perhaps all midterms are in some respects reflections on the president, even though it's a governor's race, that may also be having an impact, Jack.
So when you look at potential campaign strategy, what do you see, given the economy here in Texas and that many Texans believe are more upbeat about what's going on here in Texas than they are the rest of the nation, and given the fact of President Biden's unpopularity here in the state?
Well, I think that's an important factor. One, because we have all indications that the economy is going to be the top, if not one of the top issues, come November. So if you figure that people in the state of Texas think that the state's economy is doing better than the nation's overall, as our polling and finds out that they do, then that becomes perhaps an advantage for the incumbent governor. The second part of this is that to the extent to which any midterm is in some respects a reflection of the popularity of a sitting president, especially a first-term president, well, in that case, even though it's a governor's race, you might find a nationalization or a national effect in this race, and that also could potentially accrue to Abbott's advantage.
You know, we have seen a lot of tragic events recently here in the state of Texas. Obviously, the Uvalde shooting was horrific, and I'm wondering, what impact do you think that may have on the governor's overall ratings?
Well, the governor gets net negative approval for handling the shooting and the events in the wake of the shooting.
You and many other Texans say high gas prices, inflation, and the economy are the most important issues facing you. What's interesting, though, is Texans feel more upbeat about the economy in our state than the national economy. Here's more of my conversation with Anthony Salvanto.
Let me show you what Texans say about the economy, and this is our representative sample in our poll because we wanted to hear from Texans, and what they say is that it's a mix. It's a mix of fairly good, fairly bad, very bad. This distribution, though, when you compare it to the national ratings, is better, because on the national level, the number who say that it's very bad is now 75% in our most recent national polling. So just the fact that Texans think their economy is a mix in that relative comparison is pretty good. Let me show you this other thing, Jack, because I thought it was really interesting. When you look at one of the things going forward that people are talking about, they are more optimistic about the Texas economy at 57% than they are about the national economy. Now, why do Texans feel that way? We'll get into, but that's one of the things that I think stood out in showing how Texans were more positive about their own local economy, their state's economy, than they are about the nation as a whole, Jack.
Yeah, that is a very sizable difference. And, driving around here in North Texas, it seems like there are cranes everywhere. You talk about the official bird of Texas, at least here in North Texas, it might as well be the crane, because that's all you see. New developments, new buildings going up, corporations moving here all of the time. And I'm wondering what people said about all that.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because we asked Texans how they felt about the growth of the state. To your point, right? And we all know it is one of the fastest growing states. Well, Texans told us they thought that businesses moving in, building growth and development were by and large making things better in the state. That popped out for me, because it's not something you always hear around the country. You'll often find people who say, well, things are changing too much, too fast. Not in Texas. You've got this majority saying the new businesses and the building and growth are making Texas better. And that helps explain also why they feel more positively about the state's economy, again, relative to the nation, Jack.
Yeah, and what's interesting is it's all about jobs here in Texas. I mean, everybody preaches it, from state and local leaders just to everyday Texans. It's all about jobs. But one of the interesting things, too, that we're finding, just like everywhere else, is gas prices and inflation. Texans are not immune to this. I was talking to some lady filling up her car a couple weeks ago, and she was telling me it's $90 to fill up her vehicle every 3 days. And I said to her, how are you going to make this work? She's like, I can't. And so I'm wondering, what did you find in the survey about gas prices and how it's impacting people and the decisions that they're making to make ends meet?
Yeah, you're exactly right. They're not immune, and it's not all rosy. We wanted to make that comparison to the national, but the rise in prices, and in particular gas prices, are affecting Texans. So let's start there. There's a third of Texans who call higher gas prices in particular a hardship, and there's another third that rate them as difficult. So that's an impact. That's a big impact for 2/3. And there's another quarter who then describe them as inconvenient, even if it doesn't rise to those levels. So no, not immune. And then you want to get personal. And this goes to ratings of the economy too, Jack. When people evaluate things, they do so through that macro lens, looking at the big picture, but also through their own experience. And we see that in the polling. One of the things that has happened is we ask people, okay, what are you doing because of higher prices? Or I should say, what are you having to do? And look, there's half of Texans who say they're using savings in part to pay their day-to-day bills, and there's a third that are missing some bill payments. So the story you told about the woman who says, well, I can't, that's reflected in some of this. There's going to be trade-offs because people are having to pay so much more for gas and for other things, Jack.
And what are some of the things that people are telling you, aside from how it's impacting their bills, but obviously they got to cut back somewhere? In addition, what did they say about this?
Yeah, we gave people a list. What are you doing? And what they told us is discretionary things, cutting back on entertainment. Now, maybe that's not a surprise, but it's certainly a tough choice for people. So you've got 72% there saying that cut back. Trips and travel, a similar number. Again, things that are more discretionary when people start having to pay more for necessities, these are things that get cut back. And again, we find that reflected. And then driving less. Now, some people don't have a choice, but where they have a discretion to do it or not do it, we're finding more than 2/3 say they're driving less. And then this one, 57%, it's not as many as the other things that they're doing, but that's really impactful, having to cut back on food and groceries. So again, you see that impact. And I would add here, Jack, when you look at this by income level among Texans, well, perhaps not surprisingly, but very importantly, people who are relatively on the lower side of reported income are more likely to be doing things like having to cut back on food and groceries, doing things like having to use savings to pay their bills. You see those even majority numbers a lot, but less so for people in the higher income brackets. So that's where it's having an impact, and that's where it's having the most impact as Texans tell us how this is affecting their day-to-day lives, Jack.
So, Anthony, I was just wondering, as far as the importance of these issues, I mean, how do gas prices and the economy, inflation stack up when you look at everything else that's going on, not only in the country, but here in the state of Texas?
In a word, Jack, important. They do rank among or the most important issues for most Texans. And maybe that doesn't surprise, because there are things you have to deal with every day. There are things that affect, as you're seeing, other decisions and trade-offs that you have to make in your life, and they're very, very immediate. And we often talk about the way people rate things in any poll. What brings you to an opinion or a decision that you have? Well, sometimes it's what you see out there widely, the reports you see on the news, or people you talk to removed from yourself. But when you're staring at that cash register, when you're staring at that gas pump, and things are hitting you immediately, that's when you start to see a real impact, and it affects how you perceive the wider world and what's going on. So we see that in Texas. We see that nationally as well in the way that people rate things like the economy and why they place it as a top issue, Jack.
And my last question to you on the economy is, what impact do you think this is going to have on the November elections? Because, as you know, here in the state of Texas, we've got all our statewides. The governor is up. That's the marquee race. And, you know, just in Congress, et cetera, they're always historically the party that is not in power in the White House benefits historically. Do you think this just adds the fuel to the fire, so to speak, and this really still benefits all the Republicans who are running statewide in addition to who's running in Congress?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is it does at this point accrue to the Republicans, because for the really simple reason that they're not the party in power. Now, one of the things we see nationally, because it'll affect the overall outcome in November, is that people also say the economy is a top issue. People also say that the economy is bad. It's important here, they don't necessarily exclusively blame the president's policies. It's part of the mix that they blame in the national polling, but it's not the only thing. They see other factors, supply and demand after the pandemic. And those are things that sort of, dampen a little bit of the reasons and maybe the blame, but they do expect a president and a party in power to do something about it. And that's where you then see the president's national ratings for handling things like inflation, like the economy, are very low, and lower, in fact, than some other issues. So when you think about the midterms and you think to what extent a midterm becomes a referendum on a sitting president, all of those things and that the economy becomes a really important factor. I would add, having said that, that after the overturn of Roe v. Wade, you might see a new dynamic here. Democrats say that they feel more energized to vote. Maybe that becomes a factor as well, and certainly we have a long way between now and November. But bottom line is, as long as the economy is seen as bad, any party in power is going to face an uphill battle.
Abortion is generating headlines and stirring emotions following the Supreme Court's ruling overturning Roe v. Wade. When it comes to abortion, Salvanto says Texans feel differently than people nationally.
It's really important. In the state of Texas, what do you want abortion to be, legal or illegal? You see a slight majority of men saying legal, but look at the difference with women. It is much higher at 62%. That is somewhat like what we see nationally in 67% of women having disapproved of the overturn of Roe v. Wade. But these gender breaks are important, and I would add this, Jack. You're going to see a lot of partisan talk around what should happen with abortion in Texas as well as in the nation. And I would point out, you've got the party splits, maybe not unexpected here. Democrats saying it ought to be on balance legal, Republicans majority saying illegal in at least most, in some cases. But it's not universal. And when you look at Texas, you see that you've got 1 out of 5 Democrats who says it should be illegal, and you've got a third of Republicans who fall into the mostly legal camp. And so that is a point I point out, not just in Texas, but in the nation. You don't have uniformity on this across partisanship. It's often about gender. It's often about church attendance. It's often about age. So there are breaks on all of those. It cuts across, Jack.
You know, I'm looking at that graphic right behind you, and when it mentions independents, and because more and more Texans are independents, and that's really going to be, I mean, that's fascinating to me. What do you make of that? Is it like, what, a 10-point spread there, 55 to 45%?
Yeah. This is described in part, when you talk about Texans becoming more and more independent, it's often the case that younger people are registering as independents or considering themselves independents, and that then dovetails with some of the age breaks that you see in Texas and also nationally. You've got younger people who are more likely to say abortion ought to be legal, and so you may have that, you do have that connected to the independence answer as well, Jack.
And the differences between Texans and people across the country, that was pretty dramatic as well. And I guess maybe you can understand that, right? Because there are a lot of Republicans here in Texas. It's still a red state.
Yeah. That's really sort of sometimes the simplest answer is the first one you go to, and that's right. There are more Republicans, and Republicans are more likely to say that it ought to be illegal. But, you know, having said that, we want to add this. When you ask the question, as we break it down, it should be legal in all cases, most cases, or illegal in most cases, you want to look at this distribution because there's a quarter who say legal in all cases. There's relatively very few, I want to point out, this is the case in Texas, also the case nationally, who say it should be illegal in all cases. And so many people fall into these middle categories here. Legal in most cases, but not all. Illegal in most cases, but not all. And this is where you get into policy differences and preferences, but also important to see that people sort of distinguish or gradiate on this as well, Jack.
The people in the middle, I mean, it's you know, not the extremes, I guess, is what you're talking about. And one of the interesting things to me was, you know, over the, I guess, late last year, there was a lot of controversy over the Texas Heartbeat Act, which is the current law before the new law goes into effect. And that is, you know, once a cardiac activity is detected, no more abortions are allowed, and that basically you couldn't enforce it through the normal channels. It had to be enforced through civil lawsuits. Now there's this trigger law that was also passed in the last year in the legislative session that a lot of people didn't even know about, and you asked people about that.
Yeah, we did. Let me pull up that graphic for you in a second. One of the things that we wanted to know was, what do people think is going to happen going forward from this? And the polling was conducted largely prior to the announcement of the decision overturning Roe v. Wade, but that decision was widely anticipated. So you can talk to people about what they've heard in Texas. There aren't a lot of people who reported that they knew a lot about what you described there as the trigger law. Okay, so that's something that I want to watch going forward. Are more people going to get attuned to that, pay attention to that now that Roe v. Wade has in fact been overturned, and now it goes back to the states, where in Texas and in other places you're seeing these laws come into effect. Okay, so that's number one. But also you want to say, what do you think is going to happen now, especially with women? And one of the things we asked and looked at that I want to bring up is, do people think there's going to be more services now for pregnant women? And you look at the folks among all Texans, it's split whether they think this is going to be happening. But those who say abortion ought to be illegal are more likely to think that there will in fact be more services. Those who feel it should be legal are more pessimistic from their point of view about things. There's 2/3 who think that there won't be those services. So it's not just the new laws going into effect, it's what do people think are the implications now? And you see those breaks and those splits partly depending on what you think about the legality or illegality of abortion in the first place, Jack.
Well, that's interesting because when I was speaking with a Republican lawmaker who authored the trigger law, he said that he favors adding services for prenatal and postnatal care for women and their newborns. And when I spoke with a Democratic lawmaker, she wasn't that optimistic that the Republican-dominated legislature would do that. So that is going to be very interesting to see how that pans out when the next legislative session starts in January. But I just wanted to ask you about the trigger law, because and that other graphic that you had that showed nearly half of the people didn't know about this. And this, for people who don't know about the trigger law, which is going to take effect in mid-August unless that's successfully challenged, that's going to ban most abortions for the exception of life to save the life of the mother. And it requires, if doctors are convicted of performing abortions, they could be facing life in prison and at least $100,000 in fines. So that's out there. But I just was curious what you made of that number and people not necessarily realizing almost half.
I think anytime you have major news on something, especially like this, it's going to become more salient for people. That some, and certainly there's going to be people who have been activists on either side of this who've been paying a lot of attention. Certainly there are highly politically engaged people who are paying attention to this and have been all along. They're going to be the ones who are going to be falling into that a lot, even some camps. But now that this is on the news, now that it's being discussed, we're talking about it, everybody's talking about it, does that then raise the awareness of this? When we talk about the implications going forward, when we talk about those laws, these are important numbers, because as we go forward, then if people learn about it, then we're going to have to measure what they think about it. And we're going to see it play out in terms of policy and impact, and they're going to evaluate it. So I agree with you. These are really, really critical questions to ask and things to watch going forward. This could be really one of the core things to watch, Jack.
And what did people think when you asked them, if it is going to be illegal, which it is in Texas, what did people think was going to happen?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that they say is 77% said they think women will still seek abortions even if it's unsafe. And we're talking about, again, people's perception of the implications here going forward. Some of this, a lot of this is being driven by the people who feel that it ought to be legal. And that's one thing to look at. Look at this, though, 67% feeling like there'd be more neglected children. So that's another negative implication that's seen by the public. And there's comparably fewer, still a slight majority, but comparably fewer who feel that more children will be adopted. And that's part of the discussion that you often hear, especially on those who are in favor of abortion bans or abortion limits. So you've got this difference here, but this big number who feel that women will still seek abortions, even if unsafe, at 77%, is another thing to watch. Again, as this plays out, how does the public react and what do they think is actually happening now that these new laws are in effect?
And the thing that I think is going to be so fascinating to watch over the next several months as we get closer to the November elections is what impact this issue will have, because historically it may not have led people to the polls, but that was under Roe v. Wade, the fact that it was part of the landscape. Now that it is no longer the landscape, how is this going to impact the elections, and will this galvanize Democrats enough to make up for the perceived disadvantages they have going into November.
Yeah, in Texas in particular, but nationwide, I want to go back to this chart because the difference between men and women here becomes important politically too, to a sense. And that is the Democrats, which you mentioned, rely on women voters. Joe Biden won women voters, Democrats, and when they did well in the midterms in 2018, won women voters, suburban women, handily. This is a key part of the Democratic constituency. So if they are in fact energized, if this does become a very salient and motivating issue for women, then we get a slightly different direction to the way the midterms are going. Maybe it mitigates some of what we expect are going to be a lot of Republican gains. Certainly the Democrats will hope so. And the other thing is, and then I'll want to compare a little bit Texas to the nation here. Let me see if I have this slide on the nation, because after Roe v. Wade was overturned, we asked whether or not it would make you, and this again nationally, more likely or less likely to vote. And you saw Democrats say that they'd be more likely to vote based on what had just happened, more so than Republicans. Now, part of this could be anytime people have something in the perception of Democrats taken away as opposed to rewarding voters, rewarding the process, you might get this kind of discrepancy. But Democrats are certainly hoping that this is something to watch going forward, that this sustains itself going forward, and they can get more lower propensity voters, at least on a midterm, to turn out. So again, as you and I talk and prepare to talk as we go through the fall, this is one of those things to watch. This is one of those political implications, and this is the benchmark to sort of gauge it against as we head into the fall, Jack.
And looking at that graphic there, the fact that independents, 61% it would have no effect on, 77% of Republicans it wouldn't have any effect on, that could very well be because they were already motivated to go to the polls.
A lot of that is baked in here, right? A lot of that is. I think the way to watch this going forward is you and I will look at the lower propensity to sort of middle propensity voters, which is to say people who vote but don't necessarily turn out in midterms. And there's a lot of those voters because midterms always have relatively lower turnout than a national. You might see about 50%, about half turnout in a conventional midterm. Well, as we look at voters who might be on the fence about turning out, if they, A, decide to say they're going to vote or do early, and then B, say that they're motivated by the Roe v. Wade decision, for or against, now we have an effect to measure. And that's something that then we can actually say, yes, this is having an impact and it's favoring one part or the other, or no, this is not having an impact. And that's part of how we watch this going forward, Jack.
One of the biggest issues facing you and many Texans is the state and federal policy when it comes to guns. I discussed the findings with the Director of Election Surveys for CBS News, Anthony Salvanto.
One of the things that stood out to me, Jack, was the overwhelming number at more than 8 in 10 Texans who said that law enforcement, in their view, could have done more to stop it. And also the overwhelming number of Texans who feel that it's important to get to the bottom of what happened in that event. So I think there's a lot more to watch here, and what we're clearly hearing from Texans and the public in this study is that people do want to get to the bottom of it and do want more information, Jack.
And let me ask you on that note, because we're hearing it from people in Uvalde and all over Texas. There are a number of investigations going on right now, and there's a lot of concern that the findings, the truth, will not come out altogether, and that a lot of it will be swept under the rug. So how important do you think these kinds of polls are as far as getting that word out to the people who control these investigations and whether that information does get out there?
Well, look, one of the important things we always talk about polling is giving the public a voice, a collective voice. And to the extent that all public officials are accountable to the public ultimately, we think hearing that voice is always very important in a general sense. But I think the more perhaps immediate part of this is the number of people who are still concerned about the prospects of more mass shootings. And that stands out in the concern of the public as well. So you start to look at going forward, what happens? There's a sizable number of Texans who say that the events, the tragedy in Uvalde has made them at least somewhat more likely to consider stricter gun measures, gun control measures, or changes to gun policy. So that's one implication that could come out of public opinion going forward, Jack.
And what measures do people here in Texas favor in response to Uvalde, at least as far as the guns are concerned?
Yeah, one that stands out is background checks, and that gets strong approval both from Democrats and Republicans. One of the reasons for that is that anytime we poll on measures that would go towards the people who would ostensibly be buying or using a firearm, you do see more Republicans a little bit relatively more in favor of those kinds of measures, along with Democrats. So it looks like from a policy standpoint, that could be a place to find common ground. By contrast, you see Republicans in particular are much more reticent to support measures that would ban or limit the use or the purchase of weapons in particular, Jack.
And that would seem to align with what we saw with how gun owners feel about these policies, no?
That is correct. Oftentimes you see measures that go to the person, whether it be background checks or at least nationally for many for red flag laws. You might see more support there, more so than measures that go to the weapons themselves. One thing to note is that, in particular for background checks, the state of Texas looks very much like what we find in our national polling, with support for that. So in that respect, Texans are very much like the rest of the country, Jack.
And then I know you also asked Texans what they feel would do the most help in preventing mass shootings. And a lot of people seem to really think mental health screenings.
Yeah, that's right. When people look ahead and sort of think about what kinds of policies could potentially prevent tragedies like this in the future, mental health screenings, mental health changes to policy is one of the things that stands out with more than 6 in 10. One of the things that we want to emphasize is that there are some differences in how partisans view these kinds of measures. For Republicans in particular, those kinds of screenings, I should add, also better mental health screenings, I should say, are one of the top things that they cite as potentially helping to stop things. For Democrats, it is background checks, and it is some of those measures as well. So a little bit of difference there, but again, you do see that partisan common ground, if you will, on a lot of these measures too, Jack.
Well, I know that there is right now a lot of discussion. We've had state legislature committees at the state capitol have been holding hearings on this. The governor has asked them to come up with recommendations to go forward. And now a lot of people are wondering, will there be a special session called, or will they just wait until the regular session, which starts up again in January? There's a lot of pressure by Democrats to start and get this going in a special session before then. What do you make of, the fact that this is still being considered? They want to see all this information and the debate going forward.
So some of the top answers that Democrats, which you mentioned in particular, think could do more are more red flag laws, better enforcement of current laws, as well as the background checks that we discussed. And, in that respect, Jack, there is some commonality there with Republicans. So Texas Republicans are going to look at better mental health screening, but also more religion and faith in people's lives is one thing that they think would help. Again, talking about the person as opposed to the weapon. And then also more police and more armed guards in public places is something that Republicans in the poll told us that they think would do a lot to help keep people safer and help prevent some of these. So again, you see some commonalities between Democrats and Republicans here, and maybe that's a way forward when it comes to public policy, but then you also see these differences in at least what a lot of these partisans think could do a lot as a way forward, Jack.
And then, the other question becomes, does the governor does he want to call a special session while he's also trying to run for governor? And I'm wondering what the potential impact could be on the race.
Yeah, I think the thing to watch here is the degree to which people place this at the top of their issues priority list and whether any elected official starts to meet that. We've discussed that the economy is very important. We know that the overturn of Roe v. Wade is going to be top of mind, or at least it is right now for a lot of Texans as it is in the country. But does gun policy become the key or a key issue in this race? That, I think, is something that we'll have to track, and as you and I do more of these polls, we'll watch those numbers. I do know, however, that in many cases, gun policy is something on which we see a lot of so-called single-issue voters, voters who say, and this has come from other studies, but it's a fairly reliable finding over time, who say that this is a policy on which an elected official must agree with them in order to earn their vote, and everything else falls by the wayside. So that's another thing to watch as we go forward, whether for a lot of these single-issue voters we see this come up on either side of the gun debate, Jack.
Tragedy struck again in Texas this week. More than 50 migrants died in San Antonio after they were abandoned in a hot tractor trailer. We spoke with Republican Senator John Cornyn about this and other big issues this past week.
Well, Jack, 4 weeks ago, the shooting death of 19 children and 2 teachers provoked a national response and revulsion and a demand to do something. You would think that at minimum, this would provoke a similar response and that the Biden administration would do something to secure the border and would stop this uncontrolled flow of drugs and migrants across the border. This is very predictable because these drug and human traffickers care nothing about the humanity of these migrants. They're a commodity, they're a way to make a buck. And unfortunately here, the results turned out tragically.
Well, given what you did with the gun legislation, I'm wondering, is that possible on illegal immigration?
Well, we've tried before, and I'm going to keep trying. I've introduced a bill, I think you and I have talked about it before, called the Bipartisan Border Solutions Act, which Senator Sinema, a Democrat from Arizona, along with Henry Cuellar, a Democrat from Laredo, and Tony Gonzalez, a Republican from the largest border district in the country, have introduced and offered up as to whoever might be interested in working with us. But unfortunately, the Biden administration seems to be completely paralyzed by its base, which doesn't believe in any kind of border controls. And that's been the problem. Maybe this will shock the conscience to the point it will actually prompt some action. I certainly hope so.
Let me ask you about the gun legislation that is now law. And I'm wondering, what was the key for you and the others getting this passed really very quickly? I mean, in a month's time since the tragedy in Uvalde.
Well, this subject matter is not new, but we certainly wanted to try to respond responsibly. I think what differentiates this from so much of what happens in Washington is people actually wanted to get a result. President Biden said, do something. And what we knew we had to do is something that would actually pass. Frequently in Washington, they file bills or they make statements based on the political value of it. Others say, well, we want to actually get a result. To their credit, the Democrats in the Senate wanted to get a result, and so did Republicans. And this is what we were able to produce. The single largest investment in community-based mental health care in American history, money to harden schools and make them more safe and secure, as well as to try to provide some enhanced review, background checks under existing law of a cohort or group of individuals that unfortunately is part of a all too common profile for some of these young shooters. So this is what we were able to come up with. What politics, it's the art of the possible. If you say, well, I'm not interested unless I get 100% of what I want, you ended up with nothing. And here we thought nothing. I thought nothing was an abdication of our responsibility.
I noticed on Twitter you were really providing a lot of context after the bill passed at exactly what it says. And talk to me a little bit about the red flag law portion, because this is where Republicans really push back, many of them, and express concerns about it. So what does this do and what does it not do?
Well, red flags are part of what's called generically extreme risk protective orders. They're not uncommon in other contexts like child custody disputes, domestic relations cases, but 19 states and the District of Columbia have them, including states like Florida and Indiana, which are very Republican majority states. Texas does not have one. What I wanted to do is make sure that for the states that did have one, that there would be adequate due process protection and indeed law enforcement grants that would help train people to respect those due process rights of gun owners. But for states that didn't have them, like Texas, that we could use that same grant for things like mental health courts, which we have in Dallas and elsewhere, things like veterans courts, drug courts, and programs like assisted outpatient treatment for people to get access to their medication they need to manage their mental health challenges. So there is no national red flag law, and I think that's been a source of confusion, intentional by some and inadvertent by others.
Well, I have to ask you, what was it like? What was it like for you? What was going through your mind when you and your wife were walking onto that stage at the Texas Republican convention in Houston, and you're getting booed right when you walk in and during your remarks as well?
Well, I thought it was important to show up, and particularly when I was in the midst of a important discussion, negotiation involving something that I knew that delegates felt very strongly about, as I do, which is the Second Amendment, to try to show up and explain to those who are willing to listen what exactly was in the bill and what was not in the bill. Unfortunately, there were some people there who didn't want to listen and wanted to yell over my remarks and make it impossible for others to hear. That's unfortunate. It's important to recognize that represents a very small fraction of Republican primary voters. And so I don't think is representative of the larger party membership. But the one message I wanted to convey above all others is that I would never be part of anything that encroaches the right of law-abiding gun owners under the Second Amendment, of which I am one. I'm not a threat. They're not a threat to the public safety. What we need to do is to target criminals and people with mental health problems who should never get their hands on guns under existing laws.
I wanted to ask you one other question with regard to Uvalde, and then move on quickly to the Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade. As far as the Uvalde, were you briefed when you got there to Uvalde? Were you briefed, and was what you heard different than what has come out since then? And what is your reaction to that?
I was there with Governor Abbott and other elected officials, and for the briefing, and you'll recall the press conference that the governor had shortly thereafter. One of the problems, Jack, is sort of the fog of war. Sometimes it's really hard to know exactly what did happen until a further investigation takes place. And as we've learned, that sort of fog of war was present there the day after the shooting, and it took some time in order to actually document exactly what happened. So I think that's why sometimes it's dangerous for either law enforcement personnel or public officials to come out and say definitively, we know exactly what happened and what the problems are that soon after this tragedy. Sometimes it's better to say we are thoroughly investigating it and we'll be back to you when we learn exactly what happened, because that phenomenon is always there when it's hard to know in the aftermath of these tragedies precisely what happened.
Who briefed you?
We were briefed both by local law enforcement, by the Department of Public Safety, and the mayor was there, the county judge was there, just a whole host of people. There were probably about 50 people in the room, including statewide elected officials like the governor, lieutenant governor, the attorney general, other members of Congress like Tony Gonzalez and myself. Senator Cruz was there, of course, and that's how the briefing went down.
Let me ask you about the Supreme Court's ruling to overturn Roe v. Wade. You agree with it?
I do. I'm pro-life, and I believe that life begins at conception and that abortion takes a human life. I also understand that others think that woman's right to choose an abortion should prevail against that innocent human life. The Supreme Court back in 1973 said that we're going to take this out of any public discussion, and the Supreme Court's going to lay down the rules. And that's what Roe versus Wade did. Of course, a lot of what Roe versus Wade decided seemed to be very arbitrary at the time. And it seemed like this was not a right that was actually in the Constitution itself. And I think those criticisms were valid. So this decision is now going to be returned to the states. What Abraham Lincoln said, government of the people, by the people, for the people, or what the Declaration of Independence itself talks about, consent of the governed. Ultimately, the American people are going to have to make this decision, and the elected representatives of the people in the various states are going to make the decision. Some states are going to have much more permissive approach than others, but until this point, there really hasn't been a sort of a clean slate for state legislators to consider what that policy should be. Conversely, the public is going to have an opportunity to vote on that in the upcoming elections. So this to me is a much better, much more a legitimate way of deciding this very controversial issue, rather than to have the Supreme Court try to create something out of whole cloth and say, we don't care what the American people think. This is what we think, and we're going to separate this from that sort of discussion and debate and decision.
My last question is this: just before we spoke, the Biden administration, HHS, said it's announcing they're taking steps to ensure medication abortion. And just going back to what you just said, do you think Congress could take this issue up?
Well, I think the issue is now in the hands of the states. I've voted for a number of provisions, including pain-capable abortion with some limits. But I think the lesson of Roe versus Wade is that it's probably more appropriately decided at the state level, because some states are going to decide things differently, much as Europe. In very Catholic Poland has much more restrictive access than, let's say, France or Germany. But I'm sure we'll be getting involved in this at some level. But I think rather than to say that this is something that 9 people wearing black robes will decide, and we don't care what 330 million people, Americans, think about this, I think that was clearly wrong. And I agree with the decision to overrule that mistaken precedent.
And then the Medicaid abortion, they're taking steps to ensure that. What's your thought about that?
Well, I know that I believe that that's already available through the Food and Drug Administration approval process. Again, that's going to be controversial. I don't know what they intend to do above and beyond what they are currently doing. I think it's we have to be careful too, because for people to self-medicate and to induce an abortion can be a dangerous thing for the mother, and certainly the unborn child itself. This is going to continue the discussion in a different context, but I will see what the Biden administration is proposing. I personally am pro-life, as I said, and I believe that life begins at conception, and I think abortion is taking of an innocent human life. So obviously, I'm not a fan of chemically induced abortions either.
If I may just ask you about the Texas trigger law, which bans most abortions, with the exception of the life of the mother. Where are you on that?
Well, I think, again, the Texas legislature was legislating in the face of the Supreme Court precedent that's basically said, we don't care what the American people think about this because we, the Supreme Court, have decided. So now that Roe is no longer the law of the land, I think the Texas legislature probably will revisit some of that. Obviously, there'll be an opportunity for voters to cast their ballot and express themselves. And that, again, I think is a much better way for these sensitive and emotional issues to get resolved, rather than the Supreme Court said, we are 9 judges, unelected, unaccountable to the people who are going to make the decision. I think this is a better way to go.
Texas Senator John Cornyn, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jack.
We also spoke with Democratic Congressman Mark Vesey of Fort Worth.
It shouldn't be that way. But as long as there is the sort of turmoil and chaos in our southern border, particularly those countries to our south, in Honduras, in Guatemala, in those various countries, Nicaragua, El Salvador, as long as the sort of instability, the issues that they're having there with narcos and drug trafficking, people are going to continue to flee. And so we need to reform the system. We need something that's more orderly. Obviously, human smuggling and what you see at our border the last several administrations is not something that is viable and sustainable long term. It's just not. And I think that it's very important for the American people of all political parties to demand that the United States Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives come together and pass something that makes sense, and that we also invest in stability in those countries. That was what Bill Clinton did when he was president, and with Colombia in particular. And now Colombia is a much more stable place than it was back in the 80s because of President Clinton's work. And we need to do something similar there in Central America.
I interviewed Senator Cornyn earlier in the day, and I asked him, in view of what was accomplished in, following Uvalde as far as the bipartisan legislation, if that is something that can happen on this issue. And he said that we've tried before and I'm going to keep trying. Unfortunately, the Biden administration seems to be completely paralyzed by its base, which doesn't believe in any kind of border controls. And that's been the problem. Maybe this will shock the conscience to the point it will actually prompt some action. What's your response to that?
I think that we need action from their side. I would love for Senator Cornyn to lay out his plan for comprehensive immigration reform. I would love to look at that. And for the Republicans to say, here's a plan for guest workers, here's a plan for comprehensive immigration reform to stop this from happening. This is all the blame of the Republicans. We have tried. We thought that we had one in 2013, my freshman year in Congress. We thought we were going to get another one in 2014, and it didn't happen. And if you listen to the rhetoric, particularly from some of our local talk radio show hosts, they almost talk in replacement language type rhetoric on these shows. It's ridiculous. And what it's done, it's paralyzed the Republican Party to the point to where we have incidents like what just happened in San Antonio. To his credit, Republican President George W. Bush tried to get a comprehensive immigration reform bill passed, but now the late Rush Limbaugh, here on one of our local radio stations, it killed it. Literally, they had people call into senators' offices and call in the U.S. House of Representatives offices and killed President Bush's immigration reform bill. And as long as they're going to engage in that language, and as long as they're going to engage in that sort of rhetoric. And if you can go back and listen to some of the old audio with people like Limbaugh talking about, oh, the Democrats, if they were serious about comprehensive immigration reform, they wouldn't let these people have a pathway to citizenship. They're obsessed with race. These Republicans are so obsessed with race and numbers that has paralyzed them and stopped them from passing a plan. And what happened in San Antonio is 100% absolutely their fault.
Let me ask you this. Is there enough, because with the gun legislation that passed, obviously no one got 100% of what they wanted. And is there enough agreement, areas that Democrats and Republicans agree, so that you're not going to get a comprehensive deal, but you can, maybe there's agreement on securing the border. Maybe there's agreement on other things, the guest worker program, I don't know, where things can be agreed upon and you work on the rest of the stuff.
There should be enough agreement, because the people that heavily support the Republican Party, they come to my office all the time saying we need to do something. The oil and gas industry, the agriculture industry, the hospitality industry, all construction, home builders, all of these people routinely, not sometimes, routinely come and see me or call me or send correspondence saying we need to pass a comprehensive immigration reform bill pass. It's a shame they haven't used their money and their resources to go on television and go on social media to fight back. But these guys are diehard Republicans. They come to the Capitol in their cowboy boots and their cowboy hats. I'm talking about the cattle ranchers now. They come and they talk with us about all sorts of issues, and usually the top issue is comprehensive immigration reform. We really need for these outside groups too that give heavily to the Republican Party and don't support the Democratic Party that much. We need for them to pressure our two senators and Republican House leaders, because honestly, it's the Republican stance on this, and them being so concerned and overly obsessed with race and who gets to come to this country based on race, that it's really stopped them from doing anything. This is 100% their fault. And the reason why nothing has been done, honestly, is 99% racial.
Let me ask you though, where is President Biden's plan? I mean, shouldn't the president come to the table and get something done? If he has, what is it and where is it?
The president has been clear that he wants to get something passed. It's up to the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate to legislate. It's the president's job to either sign a bill into law or veto it. And I have 100%. I am 110% confident that if we pass a bill and the Senate and Schumer is able to get 10 votes in the Senate, if the Republicans and Mitch McConnell will cooperate with the majority leader, then I guarantee you that we can get something to Biden's desk. And I guarantee you that the American people will like that system a lot better than the human smuggling system, where 50 people have died in the back of a truck and locked in the back of a truck and weren't able to get out. I promise you that the system that we can pass will be better than the status quo. But what the Republicans are doing, they're trying to run the clock down yet again so they can do nothing like they did in Trump's first term and get nothing passed. That's what they want to do. And as long as they can hold it up in the Senate and not provide the 10 votes, then that's exactly what we're going to get, is status quo and absolutely nothing. All of this is the Republicans' fault, all of it.
Let me ask you about the Supreme Court's ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade on Friday. First, your reaction to this?
Yeah, I was, not surprised, to be quite honest with you, not surprised at all. You have two people that sit on that court that are highly, highly political in everything they do. And the two people that I'm specifically talking about are Judge Thomas and Alito. Alito worked in the Reagan administration. He was the one that advised the Reagan administration not to push too much on Roe v. Wade because the timing wasn't right and that there would be a political price to pay. And so he was the one advising him back then. And so they thought that the time was right to get this passed now with the 6-3 majority that they had on the court. And I'm not shocked at all. They've been working on this for the last 50 years. And I think that it's a devastating blow to women in this country. I think it's an embarrassment, quite frankly, to the state of Texas. And I think that that Beto O'Rourke is going to get a bump in the polls. And this is going to be a very competitive governor's race because Abbott is just going to sit there and just blurt out the Republican talking points on this. He's not going to stand up for women. He's not going to defend individual rights as it relates to reproductive freedom in this country. He's just going to go along to get along on the Republican side because he wants to run for president. And I have to tell you that I think that is a big mistake. I think that this is going to help Beto out a lot. And quite frankly, I'm glad that it will, because I'm sick and tired of these people down in Austin thinking that they can do whatever it is they want to do and not be held accountable. And when I was in the legislature, you would hear them say over and over, you'd always hear them spouting off on the House floor saying, oh, we can, this is Texas. We can never lose the majority in the House or the Senate. We can never lose the governor's seat. Democrats can never win statewide. We'll never lose the lieutenant governor's gavel. You'd hear them saying that they can pretty much do whatever it is that they want, including stealing rights away from people. And there needs to be some checks. There needs to be some checks and balances. Oftentimes voters will use the midterm elections as a way to balance things out. And with this decision, you can see that there's disproportion here. So we need for Texas voters to help balance out this situation that we have in Austin. And it's crazy that Kim Paxton, that's under federal investigation, is talking about making this a state holiday in the AG's office from here on out. It's insane that we have gone that far to the right to where it sounds like that we're living in the 1950s.
The gun safety legislation that passed last week, you voted for it. And so just wanted to get your reaction. It's been signed into law. How impactful will this be?
I think that it will definitely help, particularly the part where you wouldn't want someone that was 17 years old, now that they're 18 and they have severe mental problems, just be able to go and purchase a gun. I think that part of the bill in particular is going to be very helpful. Ultimately, we do need to pass the background check bills. It doesn't make any sense. You look at what happened in Charleston, South Carolina, 9 people killed at a Wednesday night prayer service that could have been avoided had the killer had to wait, just another few days. It was because of a glitch in the system that he was able to legally purchase a gun. You look at what happened in Midland, Texas, someone being able to make a private purchase of a gun. We need to close those loopholes. It's not going to stop me or anyone else that enjoys hunting and that enjoys shooting sports from being able to get guns. What the Republicans are doing by not passing the background check bills are basically enabling terrorists, sociopaths, and psychos to be able to own guns. And it's ridiculous. People that are mentally unstable do not need to own guns. People that are criminals and terrorists do not need to own guns. But because of the inaction on the background check bills, it's going to be easy for someone that falls into one of those 3 categories I just mentioned to go and buy AR-15 today. And that's just, and that's wrong. That's not right.
That's all for Eye on Politics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jack Fink. You're watching CBS News, Dallas-Fort Worth.